Chapter 22 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Ecclesiastical Government and the Roman Primacy. The early period of the Church was marked by a simple government. The offices and orders were few, derived from the Scriptures, and administered without ostentation and formality. But the enlargement of territory, the multiplication of societies, the dealing with the lapsed and other classes requiring special dealing, and, above all, the bringing of the Church into union with the state, increased the offices to an alarming extent. The political system of Rome entered more and more into the Christian mind as a model for government. The metropolitan centre and the synodal bond were derived directly from the imperial arrangement for the government of provinces. Under Constantine, the Church became only the smaller within the larger empire. Simplicity of government continued until about the end of the second century, but after that the tendency was towards a complex polity. For at least 3/4 of a century before Constantine, the new taste had exhibited itself, but when he converted Christianity into the state religion, all obstacles were removed and offices multiplied. Of the minor clergy, the subdeacons came first. They assisted the deacons in subordinate services. The acolyths were assistants to the bishops in many subordinate relations. At the communion service they filled the cup with wine and water, and helped in the manual duties of the communion. The lectors, or readers, appear as a clerical order early in the 3rd century. They had charge of the sacred books of the society, read prescribed passages to the congregation, and usually consisted of ministerial candidates. The catechists were only occasionally a special order, their duties being performed by presbyters, deacons, and lectors. When the congregation was very large, they were called into exercise to propose candidates for admission to the Church. The hermeneuti, or interpreters, interpreted the sermon and scriptural selections into the language of the people, when the language was not Greek or Latin. This was the case in the Carthaginian Church, where the language was Punic. Singers, or praecentors, were used in the larger churches to aid in music. The lowest official rank was the ostiarii, or doorkeepers, who served as ushers, preserved order, and had charge of the sacred buildings. Some of these offices were in force by the beginning of the 3rd century, others not until the middle of the century. During the following century we find the other subordinate officers: the economos, or trustee of church property; the defensor, or attorney; the notarius, or secretary, who recorded and preserved official records; the parabolani, or nurses of the sick; and the fossores, or grave diggers. The chief clerical work of the greater clergy devolved upon the deacons and presbyters, whose functions remained the same as at the beginning. When the Roman Clement wrote his epistle to the Corinthians, A.D. 95, there was no difference between bishop and presbyter. The presbyter was the pastor, with all the sacred ministerial functions. The bishop was, at the beginning, the same. During all the early centuries he was only the presbyter, but with a larger government, embracing a group or territory of separate societies. Originally, the church or congregation elected the bishop, and invited neighboring bishops to consecrate him to his new office. Then, in the 3rd century, the bishop was elected by brother bishops in adjoining territory, after the manner of the election of an apostle. By the middle of the 3rd century, the election of a bishop was confirmed by the votes of all the bishops of the province, in presence of the laity and by their consent. The Council of Nicaea gave the bishops of the province the right to elect without lay participation, a mode very popular in the West, but not in the East, where the laity continued to exercise the right of both veto and direct election. The bishops were elected sometimes by acclamation of the multitude, as in the case of Cyprian, and the bishops, presbyters, and other clergy were compelled to submit. It is historically true that in such cases the choice was generally a wise one. The people knew their man. With time, the prerogatives of the bishop enlarged. At first his power was limited by dependence on the cooperation of the presbyters. He could nominate the clergy, but could not advance to orders without the vote of the presbyters. He could not determine doctrinal questions, or discipline, or general administration. He had to summon the clergy of the diocese and submit the questions, and abide by their vote. The government of the local society was vested in the hands of the laity, and the presbyter was only the spiritual guide. The process by which the bishop became the chief officer was this. From the first society another radiated, and still others from them, until there was a group of churches which extended even into the suburban parts. The parent church was held in highest esteem. The bishop's residence was supposed to be in connection with it, but over each church there was a presbyter, and over all the bishop, whose spiritual functions were no greater than those of the humblest presbyter in the diocese. There was some variation, according to place, in the independence of the individual society. In Constantinople, for example, the presbyters of the mother church served the three filial churches in order. There was a tendency of the richer suburban churches towards independence. In time they were grouped, and had their bishop, who was called a chorepiscopos, or rural bishop. This office became a source of serious disorder. The rural bishop was not acknowledged to be equal to his brother in office in the city. Several of the provincial synods of the 4th century took from the rural bishops the right of nominating the clergy. Finally, the chorepiscopos was abolished by the Council of Laodicea, a.d. 360, and of Sardica, a.d. 347, though his office continued for a long time afterwards. Its functions gradually became merged into the order of the presbyters. The metropolitan authority was closely related to the diocese. The word metropolitan does not appear before the Council of Nicaea, but the idea had been in force from the earlier period of the expansion of the Church. The city where the gospel was planted, and from which it extended into other regions of the province, was the maternal city of the Church of the whole territory. In due time, other societies, remote from the centre, were formed, which grew in number and importance, and were grouped into dioceses. But the connections were kept up with the central authority. Rome, for example, was the original Italian church, but other cities in due time received the gospel, such as Tusculum, Tibur, Velitrae, Ostia, and Portus, each of which became a diocese with a separate bishop. Now, the bishop living in the original society was the metropolitan. He was always regarded with peculiar reverence because of his supposed attachment to the doctrines and usages of the Church. The metropolitan had important rights. He could convene provincial synods, preside over them, and see that the conclusions were enforced. There were 6 metropolitans: those of Rome, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Ephesus, and Corinth. The patriarchate was a higher office than the metropolitanate. The number of metropolitanates was reduced to 4 general patriarchates: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople. This was an imitation of the political division by Constantine of the whole Roman Empire into 4 prefectures. The patriarchs consecrated the metropolitans and the bishops of the diocese, summoned the synods of the whole patriarchate, had supervision of all general ecclesiastical affairs, even the court of final appeal, and could have legates at foreign courts. The Patriarchate of Alexandria comprised 6 provinces: Antioch, 15; Constantinople, 28; and Jerusalem, 3. Many things contributed to give preeminence to the Roman bishop. The Church of Rome was distinguished for its conservatism. It was firm in the midst of many heresies. After the overthrow of Jerusalem, it was believed to be the oldest apostolic church. Its good quality of faith was well known, or, as Paul says, had been "spoken of throughout the world." In the giving of alms, in missionary zeal, and in doctrinal purity, the Roman Christians had no superiors. The certain residence of Paul in Rome, and the already growing impression of Peter's sojourn there, were important apostolical associations, which clothed the Roman society with great sanctity. By the middle of the second century there was frequent mention of the primacy of Rome. In the early part of the third century there was a revision of the recognitions, in which the idea of a Roman primacy was made very prominent. So soon as this intimation was expressed, there were strong views against it. Cyprian declared that each bishop is equal, and that the Church is a unit. "Be it so," cried Origen, when he heard of the new Roman claim to foundation by Peter, and therefore preeminence. "But if Peter is the only one on whom the Church is built, what becomes of John and the other apostles? Is Peter, forsooth, the only one against whom the gates of hell should not prevail?" Irenaeus spoke in a similar strain. And yet the trend of the general policy was towards Roman centralization. Each new Roman bishop advanced beyond the claims of his predecessor. Zephyrinus held that he alone should be arbiter on the discipline of penitents. Victor assumed the same right on the Easter controversy, and Stephen asserted a similar claim on the baptism of heretics. The resisting force lay in the Eastern Church, where Antioch was leader. But there was little cohesion in the East. It was regarded as provincial, while in spiritual affairs Rome came constantly into more prominent leadership. In due time, little or no attention was paid to the Eastern protests. When Firmilian, the obscure bishop of Cappadocian Caesarea, dared to charge Stephen of Rome with boasting of episcopal superiority, he was only laughed at in the Western metropolis. Constantinople was called New Rome. When Constantine made the obscure Byzantium, which had been subordinate to Heraclea, the capital of Thrace, his vast capital and the centre of imperial authority, much advantage to the Church was expected. But the result was not satisfactory. When he passed away, there was little purity left. The palace became a nest of intrigue and revolution. The Turkey of our times, with its plots and counterplots and its nameless corruptions, is only the modern reflection of the depravity which dwelt in the imperial home of the successors of Constantine. The members of the court frequently hurled theological terms at each other, while the wranglers of schismatics were transferred to the homes of the nobility with little loss of bitterness. As in the Bosphorus one sees the tumultuous flow of northern and southern waters, so, beside its beautiful and historic banks, in the fourth century, one could see the meeting of all the conflicting thoughts which agitated the whole Eastern Church. Each new party hoped for success from imperial favor. The agitations around the eastern half of the Mediterranean became so serious as to retard missionary operations, to threaten unity, and to promote spiritual decline. In the West the life was more steady. There was no emperor to lean upon. When an Eastern heresy reached Rome, it was generally throttled or vivisected without much ado. The Roman Church life had the equipoise of power and of faith in its high destiny. It was willing to hear any new thing which came to it, but not to go out in quest of novel ideas. It possessed neither the wish nor the talent for theological invention. It was willing to wait and to profit by blunders elsewhere, but not to look backward except to gather up supporting traditions for a steadier and farther march into the future. End of chapter 22.